Hey guys, welcome back to Chris and Retro. Tonight's video, I was hesitant to share it just because of I don't want to step on somebody when they're down, but I think it's a pretty powerful illustration of what we've been talking about here on your high risk living, and I have a personal connecting story to what I'm about to share tonight that I want to make sure that I paint this correctly. So for those that are return viewers to the show, you know that I'm not exactly the most adept at on the fly interaction with sharing and things like that. But I got a number of things I want to share with you tonight, and hopefully it's something you'll find useful as you travel your journey in your life. And some of the things I'm going to try to point out tonight. Um, UFC Hall of Famer Pat Miletich. I'm not sure if you guys know who you are. For the youngins on here, you might not know, but the UFC wasn't always this big staged event that it used to be, that it is now. It wasn't. It was very small and in many states shunned. Pat Miletich was one of the first guys to come up through that really was a foundational member of that whole program. The Gracies were involved. Matt Hughes, some old names that Ken Shamrock. These guys were all names that came up through about the same time, and were the names of the sport at the time. And Pat Miletich was one of them. He went on, and as a result of his career in the UFC and the impact that he had on the sport, he is a Hall of Famer in the UFC. Pat, you may have run into him as an announcer on the UFC for a while before he had somewhat of a falling out with Dana White. I don't know about Pat's side of the story, but I know Dana White's very publicly antagonistic to Pat Miletich and his views on life. I'll share with you just a real quick video of Pat and some of the things some of his participation in the sport. And for those that don't know it, it'll give you some context where we've come in this sport. And I think you guys will appreciate this.
It's not a game, it's a rich thing.
As you can see, all the fanfare isn't really there. Sponsorships aren't there. It's just set up and go. So Pat's known for a good mix of his kickboxing and striking, but also his ground game obviously is impeccable for the time. I'm not sure how he did today, but back in that time, he definitely was a strong competitor. Going for the armbar. So you get the idea. It's been a while since Pat's been in the ring, and the sport's come a long way, and he was a real pioneer of the sport and somebody that I respect his contribution. He came up with a program called Miletich Fighting Systems, and that's been known. Even if you played if you're a gamer and you played some of the early UFC games, one of the gyms that you could put your fighter in was the Miletich Fighting Systems, and so that's Pat Miletich. Pat also has a number of podcasts. He had some a pretty large network of independently run radio stations in the Midwest. So he's got himself out there in terms of getting his voice out for a variety of different things. He is known for some kind of crazy thinking and some wild conspiracy theories. So there was always that that you had to consider with Pat. Now, I was fortunate, and I'm sorry for not engaging with the eyes, but I'm looking forward to the next video I want to show you. So I was fortunate with Pat to have him on a show that I did prior to this one. And so I had a show that I did with a law enforcement officer, former law enforcement officer. He was a veteran of combat as a canine MP. So he was in the green zone, I guess, for a while as an independent contractor. He was in the Air Force as a canine MP, and then he was a law enforcement officer. But we did a show called 100 Proof Living: Conversation with a Cop and a Criminal. And on that show, our very first guest was Pat Miletich, because Brian knew Pat through some of the training they had done together in Brian's travels as in one stage, independent contractor for the military. So they knew each other, and as a result, he came on the show. on that show, he gave a little bit of background on what got him into fighting. It's not, now, there's a reason why I'm getting into all this stuff, because I'll share that at that point in a minute. But this is what Pat said while he was on our show about his background. He makes some observations too about, people, how the people that joke the most have, some things that they're hurting inside. But in the context of the interview was really a lot about Pat's childhood, the things that Pat's views on life, what he sees about addiction, how he sees how negative it impacts lives. At one point he's lost both of his brothers to mental health related to some sexual abuse that they faced in the Catholic Church, and the torment that had. So I guess that led to suicide and some other things that happened in their life prior to it. So Pat's had known some real struggles in his life and has, I think, a pretty unique perspective on it. And in our interview, he talked an awful lot about that, and it was great to see him in that side of it. But in this video, here's what he discusses, what got him into, what finally turned the corner for him to be a UFC fighter. And I will find that for you, I promise, and then I will play it for you.
I was always the class clown, but the people that love to make others laugh many times are the most depressed people. So it's hard to recognize sometimes. I would say what I just try to do now is just try to remind people that you gotta love yourself, man. You gotta learn to care about yourself, and that's really what it comes down to. I mean, like I say, it's just sometimes it's hard to recognize. I mean, I made a choice toward the beginning of my career, Brian, when I made a decision sitting in the basement of a house that I grew up in because I had to leave college and take care of my mother. She had a heart attack and had to leave work. She was going to lose her house and her cars, and I was working 3 jobs and I was miserable. And I sat in the basement of that house and it flooded every time it rained. And I woke up in the morning, I put my feet down in 3 inches of water, and I was mad at the world that I couldn't finish school because of this. And I wasn't mad at my mom at all. I was just mad at the circumstances. And I took a 9mm. I was training. I had won a U.S. Muay Thai kickboxing championship, and the UFC had just started. And I loaded a 9mm and I put it in the sock drawer of my dresser. And I said, I'm going to win a world title or that gun's going in my mouth. And that thing stayed there until I won a world title. And when I went home and unloaded that thing, well, I can tell you that it was a pretty emotional experience. So, I had to take myself to that level of extreme to find greatness, my level of greatness anyway, for that time in my life. I don't advise anybody to do that, but you've got to find something that's going to motivate you. You got to find passion, something that's going to really affect your life.
So that was Pat's decision to fight. That was where he saw the motivation, and that is definitely an extreme case. He was in a very desperate situation. The backstory is they had this house that was a mess. They had no money. He was trying to figure out what to do. He was feeling desperate, and he ended up making this decision that if he had lost this championship, that he was going to shoot himself. Came back, unloaded the gun, and the rest is history. And he went on to be a UFC champion. So that's the backstory of Pat Miletich. And, when we were doing this interview, that was it was on May 16th, 2019, we did this interview. So he is speaking from a position of authority with a lot of experience, but he also at this point is a UFC world champion and a UFC Hall of Famer. At the same time, he is interacting. This interview was shortly after Matt Hughes had been in his terrible accident on the train track and nearly died and had all kinds of stuff going on and depression and everything else. And Pat was coming alongside him and off camera was speaking about his support of his friend. And so Pat, at this point in time, I didn't know him other than just this interview. I had no background. My co-host Brian, he knew him well. I didn't. This is the first time I'd met him or had any interaction with him was on this show. I was on that show, and so and by the way, it was my very first interview ever that I'd ever had conducted in my entire life. My very first podcast or anything like this. So I was stressed, man. I was uncomfortable, and it wasn't the best situation ever. But it was cool to get Pat Miletich on. But anyway, so I didn't have the background on it, so my face value of Pat was like, okay, this guy's got a pretty wild recovery story, and there's some stuff he talks about in his addiction history where he's wrapping trucks around trees and everything else. It sounded like a person that was well on his way. Not everything is as it seems. So we talk about closer than it appears. And some of Pat Miletich's struggles apparently were very fresh at the point of this interview, and I was not aware of that. So in this interview, keep in mind, is in May of 2019. What I didn't know is that the prior September, he'd been arrested for his first DWI. He would then be pled guilty in March of 2019. So literally 2 months before he was on air with us, he had a DWI. He'd pled guilty to it. So I've had that experience. So my first one was in 2010, and the people generally around you say, okay, well, that happens to a lot of people. Don't worry about it. This too shall pass. You're going to be fine. I could have had it happen to me a bunch of times. That's usually what happens to your first DWI. A bunch of people coming around you and saying, oh, don't worry about it. Just move on. If you haven't hurt anybody, or if you just got pulled over, usually that's what you're going to get. You'll get a lot of other people saying you're stupid and you're dumb and what are you thinking? You're going to hurt people. And I'm not minimizing that. I'm just saying that generally speaking, that's the noise you hear when you have your first DWI. But it's not. But what I can say is that when you're seeking for ways to minimize this offense, especially if you're not committing other crimes at the time, you will gravitate towards the people that make it not hurt as much. And so that's what you're going to hear most. Well, evidently, 1 year later, on June 29th of 2020, Pat got his second DWI. So now, that tells me that there's something else going on with the decision making, and it would lend itself to believe that there's an alcohol problem here. That if in this interview we're talking about addiction and hope and all this other stuff, but yet talking about the real trials of mental health, it sounds to me like many things have been unaddressed. And all this time later, the optics, the face value, here he is still an announcer. He has all these independent radio stations that he works with. He's got a very successful podcast. He's known as the Hall of Fame, former UFC fighter and Hall of Famer. He's got all these things. He's still famous and everything. And yet, so the veil of it is that he's even speaking about recovery in public. And yet a year later, he clearly is still having some struggles. And in June 29th, 2020, he had a second DWI. Now, this leads itself to yesterday. And yesterday was the latest iteration of Pat's journey. And I believe it was yesterday. I just found it. Yeah, it was yesterday, the 14th. Pat was then third drunken driving, 1 month before his MMA return, which I will speculate on some other elements of that as well. But here we are, 3 DWI offenses in 5 years. Whatever is going on around this week of the 14th in September is something goes on there. I do think addicts have a tendency to be creatures of habit in all things. A lot of my charges would happen in February and April. Any of my significant stuff was happening in April. I have 2 DWIs, felony DWIs in April timeframe. So, there's something about all that I don't know if there's circumstances that we behave poorly in those areas of what, I don't know, but he's one that's had 2 in September. So that's what's going on. And here, Pat, and I don't want to belabor this article so much, because this is not to crap on Pat Miletich by any means. This is just to recognize that in a very prominent situation, the behaviors that we're talking about on the show all the time is that total collapse is closer than it appears. My story is not too dissimilar to Pat in the way that things fall out. I mean, mine wasn't, consecutively, or mine wasn't, 3 years apart from each other. Mine were much shorter. So I did one in 2010, and then it took me 6 years to get another one, and then it took me about 7 months to get the other one. So, I mean, I was, at that point in time, that was where I was leading into homelessness. Mental health was completely shot. I didn't care about my life or yours. I didn't want to kill anybody, and I didn't want to kill myself. I just didn't care. And I didn't care because at that point, my entire love and life and everything else was around something I hated tremendously, and that was alcohol. I knew it was killing me, but it was the only place I could find peace. And so it happens this way. So when I hear of somebody doing things like at 55 years old, going to come back in the cage, which he's coming up, he's got a fight still coming up in the next couple of weeks. At 55, he's coming back and returning fighting at 55. I'm 51. And I mean, I think about, it'd be fun to do a charity event or something like that at some point, but man, I can't even imagine actually doing it. Just the things that are going on inside our body that are not as strong as they once were. That's a very dangerous proposition, but it tells me something else is going on in his life, that he'd take the risk of getting another DWI. At the same time, he's taking the risk of going out and getting in the cage again. He's struggling with something, and I don't know what it is. I'm not tied to the man. But I think that we can learn from the situation and realize that all of us have these stages. It's just we all behave differently based on our own backgrounds and whatever else is going on. For this circumstance. I bring it out in detail like this just because I honestly struggle doing this type of thing, because if I got a lot of people that I do connect with, and I don't want to exploit their bad times, you know. Pat's story here is widely known. What I'm trying to do on this show tonight is to make a connection to say that, not see what Pat did, or, oh, I'm not so bad because Pat did it. No, it's not. It's not that at all. It's that I've talked to this guy. He's got a vision of hope and help and wanting to help other people. He's dug himself out of some pretty ugly situations to become the world champion. He has a pretty intense personality that he's committed to shoot himself if he doesn't win something. I mean, this guy's got some intensity to him. And whether he's smart or dumb or off his rocker or whatever else really doesn't matter so much. In my interactions with him, he's a decent guy. And I felt like his heart was in the right place with some of the things he was saying to support other people off the air. What I want to do is make sure that we understand that it is closer than it seems. Total collapse is so much closer than it seems. As I've said in another video on here, I'm sure when Pat got up that morning of the 14th, his intention was not to get a third DWI. Now, I don't know the rules in Illinois or in Iowa or where he currently resides. He's out in the Midwest somewhere still. What I do know in New York State, that three DWIs is a tough one to deal with. 4, it's a wrap, you know, and 3 in many cases can be a wrap. I mean, if you have, depending on your driving history, that can be it for you driving. And in this world, I mean, I'm going on 7 years without a license. It's tough to drive it's tough to have a life without a license. I've been able to make it work just because I've chosen to have my life come back regardless of limitations. But for some, that can be debilitating. I do wish Pat well, by the way. I mean, if he's struggling, he's got to get some support. I realize he's a professional fighter and he's done a lot on his own, but it sounds to me like he's losing this battle. He's 0-3 on it, and he needs to get a new corner on that one. So whatever is going on in his life, he needs to get some support. And I would encourage you too, if you're going through a similar season where you just keep getting yourself in jam after jam after jam, you're not the right solution. Promise that to you. You're seeking the wrong counsel at that point, or you're not seeking enough. I was that person. I wouldn't listen to anybody. And so for a period of about 8 months, I have a lot of guests on here that have had some very serious charges and done some really serious stuff. And they're real street guys. I mean, real street guys. I was a hopeless drunk that made a ton of stupid decisions in a very rapid succession. I had some stuff from 2008, some stuff from 2010, but then as that one season through 16 and 17 was just absolute chaos, and I caused that for myself. There's a lot of buildup to that too that was non-criminal chaos, with just me creating chaos for everybody's life around me. I don't have those very serious charges like that, but it's still, I can understand that our lives can completely fall apart. They completely fall apart, and we don't even realize what's happening. We need to seek help. We need to get outside counsel. We need to get support. For Pat's situation, I'm sure plenty of people are going to jump all over him on this. You idiot, you dummy, you throwing it. I got all of it. And perhaps his career will take, what his broadcast career could potentially take a hit from this, even though he's doing a lot of stuff independently. I don't know. Just a thought that just came into my head. He does his radio show independently. He does his podcast stuff independently. He's now fighting independently. He's doing everything independently. Perhaps now it's time to even his fighting system was named after himself. Maybe now it's time to start relying on support of others and their advice, and that might lead you down a better path if you're somebody in like Pat's shoes that thinks that way. Guys, I hope this video was helpful. We cannot do it alone. I could tell you my journey of recovery, and I've shared with this multiple times on here, had multiple components to it, and all of them had people associated with them, except for the God component, the spiritual component. God was a huge part of my life recovery. However, working a plan, making progress every single day, having people around me that I could go to when things are failing. You know, I just passed 6 years of my recovery journey on the 11th the other day, and I got to meet with a friend of mine at a local outreach center down here that I hadn't seen in a bunch of years. And him and I connected early on in my journey. I've talked about him, Eric. I want what Eric has. I said that in a very early video on this channel. Well, that was Eric that I met with the other night. And here it is, a former drug dealer. He's still got his dreadlocks. I mean, he's an avid preacher, basically. He plays music in the churches, and he's doing all these outreach programs. He works at the VA with suicide prevention for veterans. And he's just got a good soul. And sitting with him I was reminded one more time how this is not a solo sport. This is not a solo work. We have to have people along with us as we make this journey, because we have to make promises to somebody other than ourselves. We have to be accountable to somebody other than ourselves. We will continually be in wash, rinse, repeat of trouble if we are not accountable to somebody else and actually stick to those accountabilities. Making promises and keeping those promises is critical. And we got to make them to ourselves, but we also have to have people with us that are outwardly accountable. So when we're being slick, there's more eyes on what we do. Guys, I take this recovery stuff super seriously, because I'm telling you right now that alcohol destroyed my life, but my mental health got me there. So I can never touch another bottle of alcohol again, and it won't change anything if I don't work on what got me there, because I'll just manifest some other self-destructive behavior. Pat is just one example of millions that have gone down this road. He's not that special in terms of what just happened to him. Thank God nobody got hurt or killed. Thank God that he's in a situation where he'll get beyond this and he'll be okay. If he gets help. But alcohol's a thief. Now, for all those that said Conor McGregor is never going to fall, Pat Miletich is a Hall of Famer in the UFC. Now, granted, he has not had the prominence that Conor did. He doesn't have the businesses he does, but he still was at that level of power. Donald Trump, billionaire, facing prison. All it takes is the right enemy, or the wrong circumstances, or the big mistake, and it doesn't matter who you are. Living high-risk living can cost you everything, no matter how slick you are, or how cool you are, or how much money you have, or no matter what. It doesn't matter who you are. All it takes is the right enemy or the wrong decision at the wrong time, and it's total collapse. So no matter who you are, if you're the desperate alcoholic struggling to get back on your feet, or addict and you're struggling to get back on your feet, I promise you there's hope. It's going to take work. You got to put in the work. You can't just float along and thinking you just escape that first DWI and you're going around talking about addiction recovery and then get another DWI and just kind of sweep that under the rug because it was just, it happens. And then have the third one come, and now what? Because all those excuses and all that stuff that got you here to 3 clearly are not the truth of your situation, and they're not solving your problem. So if you're struggling in addiction right now, I promise you there is hope. I promise you there's hope. But the stories you've been telling yourself all along and all the excuses you've been making and everybody's fault that you're putting it on, that is not how you do it. You must get every single thing they said you couldn't have, and you got to have recovery on your mind as your number one priority, because everything else falls in line when you're there. I couldn't possibly believe anything more than that, based on my own struggles and how easily I get sideways if I'm not rigorously going after it. In the words I say and the actions I take every single day. There's no time off from this. I wish Pat well. I wish you well if you're in struggle right now. There is hope and there is help. You've got to get the help. You're your worst counsel if you're finding yourself in this repetition of problems. Guys, I really appreciate you. Thank you for watching the show. Please like and subscribe. Share it with whoever it is that you think would benefit from this show. And, between now and the next time we talk, please stay out of trouble.